throughout this whole book, there are things given for us to understand. We tend to think of people in captivity as not having, as wanting, as being miserable. But that's not the picture that's painted. It appears because of Daniel's favor with each successive kingdom's ruler, somehow he managed to protect the people's freedom, even while they were in captivity. So do not think of them as being in prison or in jail. Now, we have some Psalms, Psalm 137, that talks about by the rivers of Babylon, they couldn't sing because they were depressed. I don't think that lasted very long, and it may have just been a handful of people. Because if you read carefully, it really suggests that Daniel's influence helped the people live a relatively prosperous life in Babylon, and is most likely the reason why so few people returned when they were allowed to. A lot of people would not refer to Daniel as a traditional prophet in the sense of the prophets we've looked at. And they would be right by saying that, except that our Lord in Matthew 24:15, I believe, said, he quoted concerning the prophet Daniel. So if the Lord calls Daniel a prophet, he's a prophet. But make no mistake about it, although his work is very different than all the other prophets' work, and I'll explain why in just a few minutes, he is absolutely, unequivocally a prophet. So what we have is this book that has immense importance for us concerning New Testament prophecy and end times or eschatological understanding. Daniel most certainly was of noble descent, and he was taken captive during the first period of the southern kingdom. Remember, the northern kingdom's already gone. We're looking at the southern kingdom, and this is literally now, we're no longer talking about the last call before the people are taken away. Daniel starts his ministry as one who was taken at that time and spends the complete duration of his ministry in captivity. And we know that from internal evidences, which I will point out to you. So first of all, let me just talk about some backdrop here. The 3rd century writer, Porphyry, he was a Neoplatonic writer. He said that there were many theories as to why people rejected Daniel's writing. And I think the biggest thing where it's so difficult for people to, they'll tell you anything. They'll say it was written much later. The problem is that even if you wanted to attribute the writing to much later, it's too hard for people to understand that one man could be given the ability to see successive empires rise and collapse, as well as other information that would be so at least a few hundred years removed from him, let alone talking about, because Daniel does talk about the kingdom of Christ. So let alone talking about the distant future. So for that reason, many people thought it's impossible. My stance is it's impossible for anyone else to have penned this, because just the nature of how this book flows, and very apparent to me why God used Daniel. There's so many, like you say, it's very, very clear these are reasons. But let me just say, most of you know, you cannot understand the book of Revelation without Daniel. It is a pivotal key. And if you understand terminologies laid out in this book, because without Daniel, you cannot understand the book of Revelation. And without Ezekiel and parts of Zechariah, you cannot understand the book of Revelation. So as we get into these prophets coming towards the end of the Old Testament prophets, you realize God wasn't doing some independent work here. He was laying the foundation to be picked up by writers Paul and John to tell us about that future time in their time. So it's interesting, if somebody were to just take the writing of Daniel and look at John's writing, for example, and one has to be clear about this. Daniel will use defined terms that were either revelation given to him or understood by him. John picks up those same terms of understanding. So make no mistake, this is not a concept that a human being could invent and perpetuate, because otherwise, without the framework I just told you, terribly confusing, makes no sense. Apart from the great eschatological disclosures in this book, I would say we also have themes regarding end of days, the manifestation of the Antichrist, the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, second coming of Christ, the time of the Gentiles, the resurrection, and judgment. They are all treated by Daniel. So that's what makes Daniel so unique. Now, the book begins by telling us about the end of Judah. That's how the book opens. That statement that just starts within the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. That is the first wave attack on Jerusalem. It is the beginning of the end of Judah, right here being painted for us. Daniel says he and 3 of his friends were taken captive when Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem. We have a very, very good timeline embedded throughout this writing. For example, Daniel says his 4th vision was given to him during Cyrus's 3rd year. And if you recall, Cyrus is the one Isaiah spoke about, who said that this one would basically be the one to issue the decree, which he eventually was, to let the people go back to Jerusalem. There's only one problem. For example, now you're starting to see, how could Isaiah have known something that he spoke about way before Cyrus existed? How is that even possible, right? So here we have good indicators of time. And that timeline tells us that Daniel's ministry, just his ministry, had to be over 60 years. Do the math. He's taken about the time of 605 BC, and we know that Cyrus's timeline, the 3rd year of Cyrus would put it at about 539 BC, and we know that his ministry extends. So he could have been at the end of the writing here, somewhere in his 80s, most likely. So there's a lot there to treat, but there are all these internal timelines that if you look for them and line them up, that's why I told you, knowing the history is the key to properly putting things in their place. If you know who ruled when, you're not going to get confused when you read, and you're also understanding that the times given are not just for sake of, hey, you know, the sun was out today. No, there's purpose for this. So in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, telling us who was king in the first wave, because there were successive waves until the complete fall of Jerusalem. This is the first wave. So we have that. We also have what I would say is Daniel being an ordained tool or an instrument in a foreign land, because once he's taken there, and you begin to understand what God was doing, not like the prophets before that were warning the people, turn back, repent, judgment is coming. He was placed in the position that he obviously attained, and it's no doubt that God did that, for people to know who God was, because he was in a land that didn't recognize or know God's ways, okay? And obviously God is using Daniel, and this is why the dreams given to Nebuchadnezzar, if you know the book, great, and if you don't, please read it after today, because whatever information I'm putting out may help you understand it better. So Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and all the people around Nebuchadnezzar cannot interpret his dream. No one can. And you have to remember that this is a society that has great weight on its wise men, on its religious leaders, the many myriad gods that they serve, specifically Baal or Bel. So Daniel is the one who is in that particular place to be able to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. So you've got, this is the weirdest thing, God revealing himself to the king by way of Daniel's interpretation. So it's kind of one of those things where you see God was working in a very interesting way through Daniel. Like I said, you're going to have so many different messages, and they're all going to reveal either the coming of Christ, the raising up of Antichrist, the stone kingdom. These are all important concepts for anyone who's interested in what's going to happen in the end of days. It's all very important. So it begins, as I said, with Judah's initial captivity to Babylon, which is the starting point is 605 BC, extends. This book will extend all the way to basically the millennial kingdom. So there's a lot covered in there. Christ and his, we'll call it attachment names like the stone kingdom, the smiting stone, who will bring about the destruction of a world system. And then we will see the stone, Christ, become in the mountain, the millennial kingdom, which fills the whole earth. This is a kingdom that will never be destroyed, as he says, and will stand forever. You have to ask yourself, if somebody prognosticates something, but it's very vague and ambiguous, that's one thing. But when specific things are given, and they're given with great clarity. So, for example, in one of the dreams that Nebuchadnezzar has, he says that he saw a great vision, this statue that we're now going to see and discuss, the 4 metals in it. And when Daniel gives the interpretation, we have the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire described in that, the Grecian Empire, ultimately Rome, and at the very base we talk about the Stone Kingdom. So, or the Western empires, by the way, the 2 legs separating, and these divisions will be the revived 10-toe kingdom that we talk about in the end of days. Now, the reason why this is so important, because in Daniel's time, I just told you that we know in Cyrus's 3rd year he was still serving. And so that means we've passed through the Babylonian to the Medo-Persian, but the Grecian Empire had not yet basically conquered, through Alexander the Great, had not yet conquered, and Rome had not yet become a power. Yet these are all foretold by Daniel in his interpretation. So what gets me is this, I'm going to go back to this, people saying this has to be a late writing. Well, how late do you want it to be? Because even if you want to play with, and I've read all the theories, even if you want to play with those things, Daniel would have been alive to see, obviously the Babylonian Empire was still standing. He would have been alive to see the Medo-Persian Empire, but he would not have been alive to see Alexander the Great conquer the then known world, let alone his 4 generals take the conquered kingdom and take it into 4 parts and basically, for the most part, disappear after, say, 200 or less years. That's all written in this book. So if you want to go to the latest date of the Roman Empire and say it's a late writing, you'd still have issues, because what he also talks about are things that are very hard for most Christians to even wrap their mind around, which is these kingdoms that basically were all powered by the same spirit, like the spirit of Antichrist, okay? So there's a lot of difficulty there. Nebuchadnezzar's pride is basically manifested in this statue now that I just discussed as first vision and statue. And you have to think about this. A leader that builds a very big statue, thinking it's to himself, but the interpretation is basically the pride of Babylon, which will then be consumed by another nation, another empire. It's the rise and fall. So when we say this requires, even if you are an unbeliever, this requires you to pay attention. How it is possible for anyone to foretell? Is it just luck? I don't think so. So, of course, Nebuchadnezzar has this great giant statue erected, 90 foot high, 9 feet wide, in the form of a man, and he demanded that they worship it. Okay then, so Daniel and his friends refused. If you know the story, you know they were thrown into the fiery furnace because of their refusal to bow down to this figure at Dura. And I think, again, this book is just so complete with not only foretelling of history, but giving us some understanding. Because if you remember, while they are in the fiery furnace, someone says, I see a fourth man, right? There was only supposed to be three. I see a fourth man, likened to the Son of God. That was uttered by a pagan person. So did that mean that they thought they saw an angel, or did they see the pre-incarnate Christ, which is what I would believe? They weren't consumed by the fire, and even more remarkable is that they're let out, and the people who threw them in are thrown in there because of their deeds. If that's not karma, I don't know what is. But what I think is amazing, I've skipped over some important insights, so I should probably kind of take a step back. In the beginning of this book, you have these Daniel and his friends being deported, and they're told they're going to get a portion of the king's meat, which should have, by any means, somebody said, wow, we're going to get the same food as the king, except that Daniel knew that that was undoubtedly meat that would have been sacrificed to their god, so he refused to eat it and basically asked for pulse, vegetables. And of course, he's indulged, and they're saying, look, their continence, after so much time eating these vegetables, their continence is better than eating the king's meat, which has given some people the idea that, vegetarianism is the only way to go. I'm not going to say anything on that, except that worked for Daniel for a specific purpose. Right? Like, there was a purpose why he said, give me vegetables, because those vegetables would not have been offered to the gods, right? They wouldn't have been sacrificed. So, okay, I think that's pretty clear. But they find favor because of their whole attitude. They weren't, they had principles. Daniel specifically did not want to eat this food, but nor did he want to insult the king. And they end up finding favor with this eunuch who basically, commits to helping them. And it's just, I think, very interesting. The character of Daniel is one that felt very committed to God, did not want to betray what he knew of God. And I believe that's why God used him. Because, anybody else in captivity might say, well, let's just eat the food that we have here, otherwise we're going to starve and die. And his way was to say, I don't want that which was committed to idols, but that the Lord would keep him strong with whatever other provisions were given to him. So I think that's an amazing part of his character. Okay, so he interprets one dream, then he interprets another dream. This one is the dream or the vision of a great tree. That would be in chapter 4. It is a symbol of Nebuchadnezzar's pride and imperial self-exaltation. Daniel interprets the vision. If you were in chapter 4, the interpretation of that vision is verse, I think, 20. Well, actually, that whole passage is the interpretation, but 28 through 37, verses 28 through 37, he basically kind of line by line says exactly the interpretation. So he has to tell the king that the king would be punished for his pride by temporary insanity, which, he imagines himself as a wild beast. There's trust me when I say there's slight humor in this, because nowadays people don't have to have a dream, they simply identify as a cat, right? Berosus, a Babylonian priest of the 3rd century, notes that Nebuchadnezzar, after he had reigned 43 years, was suddenly invaded by sickness, and the 7 times that are mentioned in that particular chapter are 7 years. Eventually the king is restored to his health, and something interesting, he praises the Most High. So God was working at every level to reveal himself. And the power of Daniel's ability to interpret when no other wise man, no one else could do that, is kind of interesting. So, all right, in the 5th chapter, there's the feast of Belshazzar, and the moral decline of the nation is evident. And when I say moral decline, it was already in moral decline, but it's getting worse and worse. Daniel is brought in to interpret the mysterious handwriting on the wall. So we can see definitely, again, you mean there's nobody else that can interpret this except Daniel? That's right. So he basically declares this judgment upon the Chaldean Empire. The writing, which if you have a Bible like mine, is in boldface, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And there's actually kind of, we'll call it a mild interpretation. If you're reading in the 5th chapter, starting at verse 25, onward, it says, this is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. And Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So very interesting. And the reaction, by the way, the king's reaction at this time is what to do, what? To clothe Daniel in scarlet, put a chain of gold about his neck, make a proclamation concerning him that he should be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Very interesting. And then that night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. Means speak fast and carry out your actions quickly. Never mind. But there are some things here to look at. So, of course, mene, numbered, right? Thoroughly numbered, tekel, weighed, and upharsin, divided. But Peres, there's an interesting word if you're reading this in another language. Peres, which is a word play. It is the past participle of divided, but a word play on Paris, Persian. Very interesting. You have to look for it if you're reading it. The important message here, of course, is the Chaldean Empire was completely numbered, weighed, divided among the Medes and the Persians. So literally, this is the end. If you were still doubting about this book, the interesting thing is that this interpretation was given, and then, of course, we read that Belshazzar dies, but it says, and then Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Very interesting that if this was written after the fact, even in close history after the fact or close to the events, very interesting how with certainty that he knew that this would be the kingdom to take over that kingdom, which is just going to be repeated through Daniel over and over again. Remember what we said about repetition in God's book, right? So when something is repeated many times, pay attention. Okay, so Daniel is now aged, probably we're moving into the latter part of his ministry. Darius, in the writing here, will be also associated with Gaburu or Gobirus, who took charge of Babylon immediately after Belshazzar's death. Daniel's long career and his prophetic words of a Medo-Persian victory were most likely why Darius placed him over in a government overseeing very high-ranking positions. So throughout this whole book, there are things given for us to understand. We tend to think of people in captivity as not having, as wanting, as being miserable. But that's not the picture that's painted. It appears because of Daniel's favor with each successive kingdom's ruler, somehow he managed to protect the people's freedom, even while they were in captivity. So do not think of them as being in prison or in jail. Now, we have some Psalms, Psalm 137, that talks about by the rivers of Babylon, they couldn't sing because they were depressed. I don't think that lasted very long, and it may have just been a handful of people. Because if you read carefully, it really suggests that Daniel's influence helped the people live a relatively prosperous life in Babylon, and is most likely the reason why so few people returned when they were allowed to. Now, the book can be divided into 2 parts. So you've got approximately 6 chapters that deal more with the historic, and 6 chapters that are more about, we'll call it future prophecy, not yet. Even though many things within the first 6 chapters point to the future, they're historical things that will happen to the leaders of that day. And so, for example, in the 7th chapter, we read about Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts. And once here we have the same empires that will come up. The same empires are going to be repeated. The difference is that the statue that he interpreted, we'll say that might represent the outward display of this type of different kingdoms or rules and their governments, while the vision in chapter 7 reveals intrinsic, we'll call it a power or force that is driving that, for example, Alexander the Great, and many people will discuss this and have questions about this, but I really believe that he was probably possessed by something that made him want to conquer as much as he did. I'm going to leave that alone, but I do believe that there is a spirit of Antichrist woven in there somewhere. That's not to say he was evil or he was bad, but that driving spirit, which is why it's attached to a further vision that elaborates a little bit more and narrows it down to 2 beasts. So 4 empires, as in chapter 2, Babylonia, Medo-Persian, Grecian, and Roman. And then when you get into the vision, there are 10 horns like the iron of Rome, 10 kings, which correspond to the 10 toes of the statue. The little horn that points to a latter day, and I need to justify what I'm about to say, but it points to Antichrist, but the spirit of Antichrist was already working, which Paul calls the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians, or in Revelation, what is referred to over and over again, starting, I think, about Revelation 13 onwards. So when you get into chapters 7 through 12, you are really getting components to help you understand the book of Revelation. Without clarity there, you're going to not be able to make any sense of anything. For example, you've got a mention of the Ancient of Days, and another reference, God is one like the Son of Man. We've got all these different nomenclatures or verbiages being mentioned, and they're all pointing to a future time. Now, my question is, you could make the case and say, for example, in the New Testament, John was on the Isle of Patmos. Maybe he ate some wild mushrooms and saw stuff and wrote some crazy stuff that no one can interpret. But when you have somebody writing here and giving you the understanding of time, which will tie into the prophecy of the 70 weeks of years, there is what I say, it's impossible to say this is made up. Impossible. Why? Because the pathway and the clarity which with things unfold here give you the sense this is not the writing of a person who ate something crazy or made something up. They are so connected that, like I said, you can't understand one without the other. So Daniel describes the judgment of nations and the setting up of the kingdom, the vision of the destruction of the little horn that is fulfilled in the second coming. So the interpretation, if you will, as I said, there's a vision. The saints of the Most High who possess the kingdom are saved as a remnant. That needs to be understood as what Daniel's saying is not that the general nations will be saved, but when he's referring to a remnant, it's the same thing that the book of Revelation is referring to, a remnant of these people. Not a remnant of the whole world, a remnant of these people. That's what's being referred to. So, but he equally is explaining that that remnant will actually see tribulation, the great tribulation. Now, don't go crazy on me, because a lot of people are going to go postal here and say, what do you mean by that? Well, that's what the writing says. I don't make these up. It's not my opinion. So if you look at it properly, it starts to make sense. I should note, in Daniel's writing, when you look at the 4th beast and the 10-toed kingdom, the confederacy that grows out of it, it is what we've said before, a revived kind of conglomerate of what was formerly Roman territory. If you look at a map of Europe, and you should do this just to get an idea, it basically kind of looks like there's an eye. If you were to take the map and flatten it, it's like an eye, and everything around it was basically Roman territory. And I want you to think about this, because this ties into some other very concerning things. For example, Britannia, which, and many places to the north, which we know that Rome, at its, just before its decline, right, was inhabiting the land we now call England or New Britain, or whatever you want to call it. So that territory, ask yourself the question, which was inherently for decades Christian, right? And now it's turned. And ask yourself, is that because immigration has succeeded or people don't care? No, it's part of, you're looking at how these territories will, some of them will basically just kind of blur together. Now, there have been proposed ideas that this revived Roman confederacy is some component of the European Union, which it has to be. But just go and look at the map of Roman, we'll call it rule, at its apex, and you'll get an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about the 10-toed kingdom. It's got to be within that realm. And if you're even curious about this, because this is being tossed around now, I'm no longer just reading this as prophecy. If you're wondering what's happening in the Middle East, mark my words on something, and I seldom say stuff, like I seldom put something out there with the risk that what happens if it doesn't come to pass. But this one is really evident because it's in my Bible as prophecy, and it's about to happen. Watch as you will watch Israel turns its attention towards Egypt and Turkey. That's next. Now, I was saying this a year or two ago with some people kind of going, okay, yeah, really? But that is the agenda. And whatever happens with Egypt, I really don't know. But Turkey definitely is going to be, there's already sword rattling going on. So if you know, you know. And most people believe that Antichrist will come out of Turkey. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I know that definitively. There's enough there to say, even if that person's origins, their generations back maybe lived in that land, I don't know. But we're seeing a lot of current things give way to the shaping up of this. You know, when the European Union became the European Union, everybody said, oh, there it is. Well, no, not exactly. Just wait, it's not done yet. So when I say to you, there's enough there that don't, and people have made the mistake also when people talk about the reconstituted confederacy of the Roman Empire, there's always this caricature that gets tied in to say, well, that has to be the Roman Catholic Church. No, that's not what this is talking about at all. The only place that you're going to find some identifying is in the book of Revelation regarding all false religions and all false worship. But that's a story for another day. So basically, in the 8th chapter of Daniel, we have the second vision revealing even greater detail, dated 2 years later than the vision in 7:1. That would bring us to around 551 BC. And the Shushan Palace, Susa or Shushan Palace, which was known as the winter place for the Persian kings, it's kind of taking place during this time. If you're familiar with the book, the ram with the 2 horns, Medo-Persia, is obviously the Medo-Persian Empire, 539 to 331 BC. Now, asking you this question, how on earth, except that God, who can see as far as and way beyond anyone's vision, we could maybe say, okay, maybe there was some way to interpret this way, but then he goes on to say the he-goat is Macedonian or Grecian in its world conquering. How could he have known that? And that's why I ask people to think long and hard. This isn't like a forced interpretation, because if you read between the lines, it becomes crystal clear. What he's talking about becomes now to us is history that's already passed. Okay, maybe you're not as blown away about this as I am, but I just like, how, right? So we know, for example, Alexander the Great's untimely death in 323 BC, and the division of his world power that fell to his generals that made up the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and they basically split everything that Alexander had conquered in 4 ways, which actually really will be sifted down to 2, but that's a different story. And that obviously each revelation gives us the understanding that Antichrist is the driving force ultimately to be revealed. These powers are historical now, but they are suggestive of future. There's something that would drive a person. Just think about this. There is an organization that basically is driving a global initiative to make sure that basically you are medicated, vaccinated, chipped, whatever it is they want to do. It's a global agenda. Who in their right mind, and I'm sorry, you may disagree with me, but who in their right mind would say, yes, I want to go, that sounds like a great plan. So it's the same spirit to dominate, to conquer, but not with good intent. The intent basically is to control, to suppress and oppress. But control is the mechanism here. So, all right, chapter 9 brings us to the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And this is where I want to talk a little bit, because this one is where people say, well, you're saying all this stuff, so make sense of it for me. And I'm going to try to. But this is one where I say to you, especially for people who are just starting out studying the Bible, they're going to be like 70 weeks. Well, there's 52 weeks in a year. You're talking about a little bit over a year and something? No. These are weeks of years. Weeks of years. So I know it's confusing, but just bear with me. The prophecy is uttered or seen in the first year of Darius, which would have been 538 BC. Daniel was praying for the restoration of the people. He had read Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years, so he had access to whatever Jeremiah wrote. Jeremiah 25 tells us about those 70 years. The revelation of the 70 weeks of years, which is 490 years, is representing a period, a total of 70 weeks of sevens. And at the beginning of this period is the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem. And during this period, the street shall be built again. This is coming out of the chapter we're looking at. The wall, even in troublous times. And the next division is 62 weeks or 434 years after this period, where it says Messiah shall be cut off. Here's where I really urge you to pay attention. Because if you start doing the math to the calculation of what Daniel said, he actually gets, and I'm going to say it's relatively, by my calculation, it's within a hair's breadth of Christ being crucified. How humanly do you foretell that? Okay, so that's what I'm asking you to look at. It's impossible. And then we leap from that to the final 7 years, or the last week of years, and that is broken into 2 parts, 3.5 and 3.5 years. And it is during the first half, the prince will make a covenant, and in the middle of the week, the covenant will be broken, and this begins the period of tribulation, the great tribulation on earth. So it's important to understand something. The last week of years, there's a gap between, when you start looking at it, there's a gap. So the last week of years have not yet unfolded. And this calculation of time, if you read the book of Revelation, is using the same mechanism to account or reckon time. Accident? I don't think so. So I'm just going to leave that there. You can do whatever you want with it. For me, I find it just mind-boggling. The whole book to me is mind-boggling. That not once did God say, go out and tell the people in captivity to repent. That time has already passed. And by the way, very interesting, if you read this book, you're going to find where it says that they could study and read while in captivity. They did have some scrolls or whatever. So don't think that the bulk of the people probably being in captivity ceased to know anything about or very little about God. And there was just a small pocket of people. That small pocket of people are the people that returned. The rest of the people, as I said, they stayed there. So, captivity couldn't have been that bad, right? All right, chapter 10 of Daniel is the prologue for the visions of chapters 11 and 12, which are basically the epilogue. And the third year of Cyrus, 535 BC, Belshazzar, Daniel's Babylonian name. Don't confuse it with Belshazzar. Belshazzar and Belteshazzar, they're two different names. But that was Daniel's Babylonian name, taken and applied to him, which means may Bel or Baal or Bel protect his life. Kind of interesting. What we read is a battle, demonic warfare operating in government of a world system. Yes. Yeah. So we read that this kind of demonic warfare operating within the government world system, and Daniel is fasting and praying for 3 weeks, challenged by these spirits, and you're going to read that in those 2 chapters. The prince of the kingdom of Persia, also taken in the grip of demonic powers, almost a wrestling match of the soul. For who? For Cyrus. You've got to go and read a little bit of secular history to know some of the battles that are not disclosed here, to understand why I'm saying that. But if you know, you know, this would have been the man that Nehemiah would have petitioned to say, let my people return and rebuild, and he issued that decree. Now, can you imagine if the devil had complete control over Cyrus, because he waffled for a time, to not issue the decree? Even those less than 50,000 wouldn't have been able to go back and rebuild. Just think about all this. There's a lot of possibilities here. But they basically do return. And then, of course, chapter 11 tells us about the wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. This is history written before it happened. Now, history confirms what was spoken as prophecy regarding the Persian kings, Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies of Egypt, the kings of the south, and the Seleucids of Syria, the kings of the north. So there's a lot there. Even the Romans, in their ships of Kittim, which is Cyprus. Tell me how you get these details, and then go back and look at the battles that ensued and tell me that that isn't accurate, because it is. That's what's so mind-boggling. Like, yes, the test of a prophet, if he's a true prophet, is if his words come to pass. But this is so out there that that's why I believe people would read this book and say, impossible. No person could know this. That's right, but God could. Think about that. So there's even a description of Antiochus Epiphanes. We have the abomination that makes desolate, which he sets up and profanes the temple. And most people associate that and sometimes conflate it with Antichrist, but it's the same spirit as Antichrist. So all along, you're looking at these world powers and an attempt to basically control and dominate. Between, in that particular chapter, between verses 35 and 36 spans an unreckoned period of time. But we know the willful king is the Antichrist of the last days, the man of sin, the lawless one. And then, of course, in the 12th chapter is the great end time period of trouble. This end is basically referred to in Daniel 8, 9, 11, 12, and there are multiple mentions of this. So the book of Daniel must be read and understood to connect, as I said, with end time events. And if you really want to go the distance, go look at some secular history on the things I've referred to and tell me how it's possible for someone to have the gift of knowing these things with specificity. And then tell me that prophecy isn't real. I'm talking about Old Testament prophets. I can't stand in this modern age where people assume that old-time prophet functioning is still doing the same thing. It's not. It's completely different. And I'll also explain that if I haven't already. But let me just pause to say Daniel's book is written in 2 languages, and it's very interesting as to the why. So Aramaic, which we find from chapters 2 and verse 4 all the way through 7 and 28. That's Aramaic, and then Hebrew for all the other parts. Why 2 languages? And this is what's really interesting. The Aramaic sets forth matters that pertain to heathen rulers, and their activities. Because Aramaic and Hebrew are very close, but Aramaic would have been a language spoken or at least understood by these heathen rulers. And then Hebrew, of course, is the language for writing, but specifically would have been more of an internal, even though they're close, they're not exact. So just kind of mindset there's a reason why it's written in two distinct languages. The Hebrew basically is where there are direct revelations or contexts that would be applied to more native inhabitants of Judah or to the people of God, specifically future time. Think about that. So there's just a lot there. The book, to me, shows Daniel as courageous. He is definitely educated. He has skills. He was put up in, from the time he arrived, once he interpreted the dream, he's put in this administrative role, and he never leaves that position. So he's a high-ranking person. And that tells me that he had to have intimate knowledge of the functionings and behavior to work around kings and their courts, had to have some understanding of world powers and world activities. So I just say there's some very interesting insight. As I've already said, his conviction, and I love this because these are small takeaways for all of us. His conviction to not eat food he thought was offered to other gods, or better yet, not shying away to deliver unpleasant news in the interpretation to the king. He didn't, when he paused, that long pause before he gave the interpretation, the way he gave the interpretation to the king was also, believe it or not, very compassionate and very thoughtful. Because he basically said the interpretation is for your enemies. It's for them. Very strange thing, but his behavior is not lip service. He's genuine to the core. His words were rooted in faith. And then I'd say a few observations about his personality. I don't think that you get to give bad news and live another day to talk about it. That doesn't seem like the way things worked. And yet somehow he delivers unpleasant messages. The handwriting on the wall, you're always going to see something. For example, when Daniel interpreted the dream, there was a proclamation made by the king heralding their God. And then when they survived the fiery furnace, he said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Those are Daniel's friends. So God was still working on a heathen nation, although it wasn't the same type of what we would envision as conversion, to get them to recognize that there was a God, a singular God, not many gods, who was acting and moving these pieces around to make this come to pass. Daniel's being put in captivity, no accident. His ability to be there and tell about the dream, no accident. And of course, as I said, the impact on these leaders. Remember, we just saw Belshazzar giving Daniel a comment and placing him in high esteem. And all the while, if you're very careful to read between the lines, you see something that is very suggestive for us to take away. Daniel was in a foreign land, foreign culture, and it did not taint him to join with the multitudes. That's a really hard thing for our day and age, because there's always this fear of alienation or being ostracized. But if you really care about the audience of one, then you'll take your stand for Christ, and you won't think about whether people are going to like you or hate you. Most people cannot stand the light. Why? Because it's exactly what Christ said. Why? Because their hearts are dark and their deeds are evil. That's why they can't stand the light. But if you really think about it, Daniel stayed the course. And this is not a message on being perfect or walking the walk every single day and not veering left or right, but that he did not alter his ways, being surrounded by others who didn't understand. He stayed strong in the faith. He proclaimed. He fulfilled. He didn't shrink back. I love this one thing that is clearly through the book. This is not, as a young man, clear into his old age, was not a coward, didn't shrink back from what needed to be done. And quite frankly, this is what the church has suffered from, in my opinion, in the last probably 50 years. Now, it's just become more and more apparent, say, in the last 25 maybe, but most people in the church do not want to say the hard things because society all around says, you've got to accept, you've got to incorporate, you've got to embrace. But Daniel didn't. And I love that. That's a great picture for all of us to understand. You have choices in life. You can take the course of the world and say, well, there's pressures all around me. Or you can be like Daniel and say, I choose to stand on the rock that is Christ. I don't change my views. My courage is not going to shift in the face of anything, including the adversary. I'm going to stand very clear. And then the big picture for Daniel and his friends. God entered in to this moment to work his good. God entered into the matter. God was actually the driving force to make that matter come to pass. The scattering of the people and the taking away of the people for 70 years was God's doing, not a heathen king. God just used that heathen king, like as I said, like a chess piece on a chessboard. Used Daniel as his mouthpiece and his tool. And there is something really profound about this, that no matter where we are in life, or in our walk, in our mindset, we can read this and kind of take something to ourselves to say, you know, maybe people are not wanting to do the hard work that's required to understand what all this means. But if you are, don't shrink back. There's always going to be somebody to come and criticize. And, you know, I don't know of any one of us here that's been thrown in a lion's den, but sometimes it feels like it. Sometimes it can feel like everybody's attacking you for your faith or for who you are or what you believe. And I love the fact, for example, that Daniel being thrown in the lion's den because he wouldn't buckle, and God protected him. Now that's not, I've seen stupid things where people they go to a zoo and they want to jump in the lion enclosure to see if they'll be protected. That's called stupid, okay? That's not godlike, that's called stupid. But the concept can be taken with you, and that is to be courageous in all things, to look life and all that the adversary brings straight in the eye, and whether that is a sickness. I tell people this all the time. Sickness is not a judgment on you. It's usually most of it, about 90, 85% of it is a lifelong environment of what you've done or not done. 15% of it is other stuff like genetic or whatever. But don't think for a minute that somehow if you're fighting disease or your health is not good, that somehow it's a reflection on, well, you didn't have enough faith. That is just a load of silliness and stupidity. But rather, we all have things to face, and we must face them just like Daniel. There's something about that lion's den that says to me, Daniel had to know, he had to have the peace of God that passes all understanding, to know that God would be with him and deliver him. And I'm asking you, none of us have been placed in that lion's den. You may feel like it, but we have less to deal with than that. So why can't we also stand and say, the promises, the Lord said he'll never leave us nor forsake us, that he'll be by our side, or where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he's in the midst. That means that in all things that we do for Christ in our life should be faced with courage, commitment, and that knowledge. Somehow, I don't know, I envy a person who can say, God will not leave me, and with their whole heart, believe it. Because most of us sit right on the fence, it's a little wavering doubt. But to have that doubt be dispelled, to say, the Lord will see me through, tells me, again, to be able to claim that promise with full faith and say amen, that is, he will because he said so. Then I'd say, take a little lesson from Daniel, especially for those of us who face the chronic buffeting of the enemy and of life. Take a page out of Daniel, and the courage, the commitment, just the mindset resonates through the book. But more than that, please read the book. It's a 12-chapter book, so it's a longer read than normal. But I'm hoping that some of this fills in some of the blanks, because we can read it and we can look at the whole thing, but if you don't have the history, the understanding, as I said, a prophet of exile in exile. And next week, if God permits, permits, we'll look at Ezekiel. And we'll find that here are two men who actively had to work in that captivity period. And they actually represent some very similar and some very different messages, which could only be done after the people were moved out of the land to give hope for the future. So there's a lot there, and this is no way an exhaustive understanding of Daniel's prophecies. This is simply to give some understanding that when you look at this, you can actually say, if the people were out of the land, and now that Judah now had actually become a territory or a province of Babylon, and the people are no longer there. Just keep this in your mind. When the world is arguing about land, they had already been removed from the land at God's doing. Think back, I told you last week and the week before and the week before that why they broke the covenant. Now God, in his infinite mercy, is still going to leave the door open. He will leave an olive branch in the future. Has not yet happened. So, I'm telling you something. This book also helps to dispel a lot of revisionist history that is being propagated out there. If you're going to be a person of the book and be a believer, read this book. Don't just read it as some good writing or poetry. There's history embedded in here that tells you why, from the time they came back and returned to rebuild, they had a brief period, we'll call it a resurgence, a restoration that didn't last long. And I think I said this last week and alluded to it. This is why by the time you get to Christ, Christ is referring to the religious leaders of his day as whited sepulchres. He's not saying, oh, great men of faith, and oh, devout and responsible and committed and courageous. They are just whited sepulchres full of dead men's bones. Those were the religious leaders in his day, and that's why 70 AD brings the end of the kingdom, typically, or the land, the occupation, and all. Now that ball's in your court to study what happens from 70 AD until approximately 1888 or 89. That will give you the clue to understanding why when people say certain things about what should be or shouldn't be, if you're going to read this book, you're going to know that one thing is a political entity. But if you're going to say it's a biblical prophecy, it surely is not. That clarity comes from these writings, not from my opinion, not what I think, right there, black and white. So I'm urging people to read with eyes open and not with some, this is how I understand it. Read it. Find other versions, by the way. I told you this last week, whether you read Amplified, NIV, alongside your King James, and it may actually deepen a little bit, even though it's another English translation, to help you understand with deeper clarity that we're looking at this incredible prophecy, most of it now historically past. So if the historic past, now finished, was 100% right, there is something to say about what's yet to come. So for those of us who trust and who believe, we can say amen, and for the rest, well, we'll talk about it later, maybe. That's my message. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.